It is a curious fact, oft remarked upon by the vicar's wife in tones of mild exasperation, that nothing untoward ever happened in Lower St. Becket until the Arts Council decided it should. For nearly 300 years, the village had contented itself with nothing more dramatic than the occasional altercation over hedgerow boundaries. An unfortunate business with a ferret and a sacristy cushion in 1884, and one regrettable incident involving elderberry wine and the parish curate's unfortunate tendency to undress in his sleep. Then came the grants, the poetry readings, the Restoration Heritage Lottery funding, and finally, in a crescendo of culture, the Lower St. Becket Musical Jubilee. "I blame Delius," said Lord Peter Wimsey, delicately rotating the spoon in his demi-tasse of black coffee. "There's something about the melodic ambiguity of modern English composers that positively invites murder." Miss Climpson, ever on edge when Wimsey took his tone to such orotund levels of facetiousness, sniffed. "Really, my lord, I fail to see how poor Mr. Delius is to blame for last night's business." Wimsey shrugged, setting down his cup with an affected delicacy he had once learned from a Czechoslovakian ballerina who could kill a man with her thigh muscles and used to drink her absinthe in just that manner. The whole evening was a failure of taste. Miss Edna Vale played the Debussy Reverie as if Debussy were a wounded cat attempting Chopin while under heavy morphine. And as for the unfortunate Mr. Gallinger, "Dead," Miss Climpson said with a sharp nod, as if this were the only relevant musical note. Slumped over the keyboard in the vestry hall, middle C sounding continuously until the organ master arrived and fainted. It would have been rather more theatrical, Wimsey mused, had he expired atop the Bösendorfer, clutching his heart mid-glissando a la silent film star. But alas, no drama, only a final misplayed F-sharp and a very unfortunate smear of blood upon the sheet music. Liebestraum, wasn't it? No, Träumerei. Schumann, though you wouldn't have known it from the performance. Quite. Wimsey folded his hands like a Victorian clergyman about to deliver bad news about the church roof. "It appears, Miss Climpson, that we have a case of grievous artistic interruption, a fatal finale, an encore no one asked for." Miss Climpson was not amused. "Poisoned sherry," she said, her tone crisp. "One of those horrible cut-glass decanters brought from the green room behind the church hall. 5 glasses poured, 4 performers, and 1 corpse." Wimsey's brows arched like well-trained greyhounds at the start of a hunt. How unoriginal. I'd rather hoped for piano wire around the throat. Something Gothic, something Wagnerian. There was, however, Miss Climpson added, a rather odd thing. "Do tell," Wimsey murmured, his tone already sharpening beneath its lazy veil. Mr. Gallinger, as you may know, was a stickler for musical perfection. He used to terrify choir boys into tears if they sang a D instead of a D sharp. But last night, she leaned forward, her voice dropping. "He played a wrong note." Wimsey's eyes twinkled. "Ah, and you think it might not have been his fingers that erred, but his mind. He played a B-flat where a G belonged. Miss Vale said it was impossible. He would never. Not intentionally." "Unless," said Wimsey, "he was trying to tell us something before his final diminuendo." He rose, brushing an invisible speck from his waistcoat. "Come, Miss Climpson, let us go inspect the scene of the crime. If nothing else, I'm rather curious about that wrong note. Music," he added with a whimsical smile, "is a language most murderers mispronounce." And so began the case of the pianist played the wrong note, in a vestry hall still smelling faintly of lavender polish and lethal beverages, beneath beams that had heard centuries of hymns, and now one ghastly chord of death. The vestry hall of St. Wyston's Church was a modest affair of oak panelling and threadbare red carpet, the kind that had once been described in a regional newspaper as charmingly ecclesiastical, and more recently by a disenchanted chorister as smelling of vicar and varnish. It had doubled as the green room for the Jubilee's final recital. A modest affair if one were feeling charitable, but a festival nonetheless. A folding table against the wall bore the remnants of a buffet, a congealing quiche, 3 limp cucumber sandwiches, and a jar of pickled onions that seemed to have been opened sometime during the Napoleonic Wars. Lord Peter Wimsey stood just inside the doorway, hands in his overcoat pockets, gaze sweeping slowly over the scene. Beside him, Miss Climpson maintained the air of a schoolmistress inspecting a disorderly classroom, her mouth primmed and arms folded as if any clue out of place might be chastised into line. The piano, an upright model of a particularly obstinate mahogany, sat squarely near the front, its keys still raised in mute expectation, as though embarrassed at what they had just witnessed. A single sheet of music, slightly crumpled at one corner, rested askew atop the stand. There was a faint smear on it, reddish-brown, neither dramatic nor theatrical, but unsettling in its mundanity. Wimsey approached, pulling from his coat a silver pencil and a small leather notebook, which he flipped open without looking. He bent forward slightly, his eye passing over the notation. Yes, quite right. A B-flat where one should never be. Odd. Miss Vale said it was completely out of character. Miss Climpson said. She said Mr. Gallagher once reduced a visiting tenor to tears over a misplaced rest in Elijah. I find it vastly encouraging, Wimsey murmured, when murderers begin with something as subtle as the subversion of musical form. It shows a devotion to craft. He moved behind the piano and crouched slightly, inspecting the foot pedals, the baseboard, and then, after a beat, the carpet beneath. There's a slight indentation here, he said, as if something heavy rested for some time just under the keyboard. Perhaps the stool? No, that's in place. This is nearer the pedals, about the shape of a small suitcase, I should think. Or a valise. Gallagher's, perhaps. Or someone else's. According to the police, Miss Climpson said, flipping open her own notepad with brisk efficiency. Gallagher arrived at the hall by foot, 10 minutes before curtain. He came alone, was seen by the verger coming in through the west entrance, and greeted Miss Vale in the hallway outside the dressing rooms. That was at approximately 6:45. Wimsey nodded absently. And the performance began at 7. Yes. Vale opened with that frightful Debussy. Gallagher followed with the Schumann piece. He played perhaps, 8 measures? Then collapsed, died before the 3rd bar was finished. Timing is everything in music and murder, Miss Climpson. Do we have the program? She passed it to him. Wimsey perused the typewritten leaflets with a faintly raised brow. Vale, Gallagher. Then a vocal trio from the local amateur dramatic society. And finally, the Reverend Lord Fanshawe, on the subject of Bach and the spiritual crisis of post-war Europe. No wonder the audience felt compelled to flee by intermission. Miss Climpson sniffed. I rather enjoyed the vocal trio. You would, Miss Climpson. They were interrupted by the arrival of a small, pinched woman in an aggressively floral print and a hat that looked faintly accusatory. She clutched a handbag as though it contained state secrets, or perhaps a more potent brand of marmalade. Miss Warburton, Miss Climpson whispered. Church committee. She found the body. Wimsey turned on the sort of smile that had once charmed baronesses and Bolsheviks alike. Miss Warburton, I understand you were the first to discover poor Mr. Gallagher in his final posture. I hardly call it discovery, Lord Peter, the woman said, stiffening. One doesn't discover a man leaning over the piano like a broken marionette. One is confronted. The sound. She shuddered. That eternal middle C. It was like being shouted at by a ghost. Yes, rather unnerving, Wimsey said sympathetically. But I wonder, Miss Warburton, if I might trouble you for a trivial detail. She blinked. If you must. When you entered the vestry hall and saw Mr. Gallagher at the piano, was the sherry decanter still present on the refreshment table? "Oh, yes," she said immediately. Though no one drank after that, of course. Mrs. Bletchley poured the rest down the sink with quite unnecessary ceremony. Good woman. And before the performance, did you see anyone tampering with the decanter, pouring drinks? Not tampering, said Miss Warburton, clearly scandalized by the insinuation. Mr. Gallinger poured the sherry himself. I remember because he asked me if I took it dry or deadly, which I thought in poor taste. How many glasses did he pour? 5. 1 for each of the performers. He handed them around, very grand, like some sort of musical ambassador, but he drank last. Ah, said Wimsey. Very courteous. Very old world. Miss Warburton hesitated. Except, well, now that I think of it, he seemed unsure for a moment, just before he drank. He looked at his glass, sniffed it, perhaps, then smiled and drank it off. I thought he was just being pretentious. Pretentiousness in pianists is rarely fatal, Wimsey murmured. But poison is. She colored faintly. I'm sure I've told you all I know. You've told me something better, he said with a courteous incline of the head. You've told me what you noticed, and that is always more important than what one knows. Miss Warburton, confused but faintly flattered, allowed herself to be gently ushered out. Miss Climpson stepped closer. You think he suspected the drink? He may have, Wimsey said, drawing a line in his notebook. But then why drink it anyway? Musicians are often mad, but they're not usually suicidal. No, I think he was trying to show someone something, perhaps a challenge, perhaps an accusation. Or, Miss Climpson said, her voice sharpening, he'd been warned and drank to prove a point. Even better, Wimsey said approvingly. He may have died dramatically, but not blindly. They were joined then by a constable, bearing a thin sheaf of notes and an expression of mild perplexity. My lord, the local chemist confirms strychnine in the sherry. Classic, said Wimsey. Almost disappointingly so. Only 1 glass laced. Gollinger's. The others were untouched. Then the killer had access to his glass alone, Wimsey murmured, and knew which he would take, or made sure he took it. Miss Climpson frowned, but he poured for everyone. Wimsey nodded. Then the question is not who poured it, but when the poison was added. Was it done before Gallinger poured, or after? And more to the point, how could someone be certain he would take the poisoned one? Miss Climpson's eyes narrowed. Unless it was marked, or, said Wimsey, eyes suddenly bright, there was a ritual to it, some pattern he always followed. Ah, human nature, predictable even unto death. They both turned as the vestry door creaked open again and a new figure stepped inside. A woman in a striking crimson coat, her dark hair pinned with ruthless precision, and a handbag that suggested it could hold either sheet music or a revolver. Miss Vale, Wimsey said cheerfully, how perfectly timed. We were just contemplating. Sherry, strychnine, and sonatas. Do come in. She hesitated only a moment, then swept forward, the faintest scent of bergamot trailing in her wake. I suppose you'll want to know what I played last night, she said, her voice low and unamused, and what I saw before Gallinger dropped dead. Wimsey smiled. Indeed, Miss Vale, but more than that. I'd like to know why you believe he played that wrong note on purpose. Her eyes flickered. Just once. But it was enough to strike the chord that set the next movement into motion. Miss Vale's gaze sharpened, her slender fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag as she moved to a chair and sank into it with a poise that suggested exhaustion, yet concealed a simmering resolve. I'm not a woman prone to melodrama, Lord Peter, she began. But what happened last night was no accident. I've known Gallinger professionally for years. He was meticulous, demanding, and above all, precise. To hear him strike that false note was like witnessing a cardinal sin. It jarred me, deeply. Wimsey inclined his head, his gaze intent but courteous. That alone might explain your insistence that it was intentional rather than accidental. She smiled thinly. Not quite. The note was deliberately played, out of time, out of tune, and out of place. It wasn't just a wrong note. It was a message. Whimsy tapped the corner of the music sheet thoughtfully. A message hidden within the music itself. Yes. You see, Lord Peter, Gallinger was something of a cryptic soul. He enjoyed puzzles, not only in the compositions he played, but in life itself. On the night of the Jubilee, I noticed subtle gestures, barely perceptible, but there if one was looking. The way he hesitated before the third bar, the slight nod he gave me just before striking the B-flat. Ah, a signal. Whimsy's voice held a trace of amusement. To whom, I wonder? To me, naturally, she said. I suppose you could say it was a cry for help. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly, and he made a few notes in his book. And yet, no one else seems to have noticed this peculiar performance. The audience, distracted by the forthcoming oratory of the Reverend Lord Fanshawe, were perhaps less attentive. Miss Vale's lips twitched. Less attentive, or less willing to hear. Meaning, Gallinger had enemies, Lord Peter. Not among his peers, those who understand music, but within the community here. Small villages breed grudges and petty jealousies like mold on bread. Indeed, Whimsy murmured. A village with secrets, then. Tell me, Miss Vale, was there any particular tension on the day of the recital? Any argument, any glances exchanged, anything that might suggest motive? She hesitated, then nodded. There was a quarrel earlier in the day, just before the rehearsal. Between whom? Gallinger and Mr. Barnaby, the local solicitor. Whimsy arched an eyebrow, an interesting choice of adversary. Gallinger was demanding some kind of settlement, an inheritance, I believe. A property dispute, if I'm not mistaken. Property disputes do have a curious tendency to become mortal, Whimsy observed dryly. Did the solicitor deny the claim? Yes, quite vehemently. I heard raised voices when I passed by the solicitor's office. Gallinger was furious and Barnaby seemed defensive. Did anyone else witness the confrontation? Miss Vale shook her head. No, I was alone. But Barnaby's dour expression afterwards suggested the dispute was far from amicable. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. Curious. And what of this Mr. Barnaby now? Has he provided any alibi for the evening? Miss Vale's face clouded. He claims to have been at the vicarage until shortly before the recital began. Ah, alibis in village vicarages. One rarely finds them watertight. Whimsy's tone was dry but pointed. Did the vicar corroborate this? Not yet. I'm sure the police will be speaking to him soon. Of course. Whimsy tapped the music sheet again. Now, returning to the musical message, Miss Vale. You suggest the note was a deliberate signal to you alone. How certain are you of this? As certain as one can be without explicit words. Human communication, especially of the cryptic kind, is rarely infallible. Whimsy paused, then smiled faintly. Nonetheless, if your theory holds, someone else must have understood this message. Someone present who recognized the significance of the B-flat. Exactly. And yet the poison in the sherry remained undetected until too late. Unless the message was also a warning. Indeed. Whimsy turned toward the window, gazing out at the drizzly autumn afternoon settling over the village. Miss Vale, I would like you to recount the exact sequence of events leading up to your performance. Every detail, no matter how trivial. She nodded, seemingly resigned to the scrutiny. Very well. I arrived at the hall at 6:30, as agreed. Gallinger was already there, setting up his piano stool and preparing the music sheets. We exchanged pleasantries, but he seemed distracted. He glanced repeatedly toward the entrance, as if expecting someone. Anyone arrive between then and curtain? Whimsy asked. Just the verger and the vicar, both making final arrangements. No one else. Did you notice anyone loitering outside the building? No. The rain had kept most people indoors. Were the doors locked before the performance? Yes, except for the main entrance. Was the sherry already on the buffet table when you arrived? Yes. Mrs. Bletchley had laid out the refreshments earlier in the afternoon. And Gallinger poured the drinks just before the recital? Yes, as I said, 5 glasses. Whimsy's gaze lingered on her face, searching for cracks in her composure. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Miss Vale, I wonder if you recall any peculiarity about the glasses themselves. Were they identical? Was one perhaps marked or different in any way? She frowned, then said, I don't believe so, though the glass he drank from was slightly chipped on the rim. Chipped, you say? Whimsy's interest piqued. How curious. Was this chip visible to anyone else? I suppose it could have been, but I don't recall anyone commenting. An imperfect vessel for a perfect musician. Whimsy smiled wryly. Tell me, Miss Vale, did Gallinger make any remarks about the sherry or the glasses at the time? She pursed her lips. Only that he preferred it chilled, which was unusual for him. He usually took it at room temperature. An eccentricity or a clue? Whimsy mused aloud. The distant toll of the church bell interrupted their exchange, a sonorous reminder of time passing, and with it, secrets festering. Miss Climpson cleared her throat. Lord Peter, the vicar has arrived and is waiting to speak with you in the anteroom. Whimsy rose with his usual grace, flashing a brief, amused glance at Miss Vale. Duty calls. Let us see what pious truth the Reverend Lord Fanshawe might enlighten us with. As they crossed the corridor, Whimsy's mind raced through the snippets of conversation. The quarrel, the cryptic musical note, the chipped glass, the changed sherry temperature, all pieces of a puzzle still refusing to yield their secret. And somewhere beneath the polished veneer of village civility, the shadow of murder waited to be fully revealed. The Reverend Lord Fanshawe received Lord Peter Whimsy with a measured smile that suggested a man accustomed to diplomacy and to walking delicately among fragile egos and parish squabbles. He was a tall man, slender and somewhat austere, his clerical collar crisp beneath a well-cut, albeit slightly threadbare, black frock coat. The faintest scent of pipe tobacco lingered about him, mingling incongruously with the faint aroma of polished wood and old books that pervaded the vicarage study. Lord Peter, a pleasure, as always, he began, though the warmth in his tone did not entirely reach his eyes. I'm sorry these distressing events have drawn you into our little village's troubles. Such things are uncommon here, thankfully, though perhaps all the more shocking for their rarity. Whimsy inclined his head, his expression courteous but probing. Indeed, Reverend, tragedy in a place accustomed to quiet and routine can unsettle the most steadfast. I understand you were present at the time of Mr. Gallinger's recital. I was, Fanshawe replied, settling into a high-backed chair. The hall was packed, the air thick with anticipation for the Jubilee celebrations. Mr. Gallinger's performance was, alas, not what any of us expected. Quite so, Whimsy murmured. Might I inquire as to your movements on that evening? It appears Mr. Barnaby has furnished an alibi that you can confirm. Fanshawe's eyes flickered briefly. Yes, I saw Mr. Barnaby here until approximately 7:15. We discussed parish matters and the preparations for the coming Sunday service. Afterwards, I proceeded to the hall to oversee final arrangements. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. And the time of the recital's commencement? 8:00 prompt, the vicar replied. I was present in the hall for the entirety of the performance. Did you notice anything unusual about the stage, the instruments, or the audience prior to the music beginning? Fanshawe paused, as if recalling. Well, the piano tuning seemed slightly off. I overheard Mr. Gallinger grumbling about it before he began, but he dismissed it, attributing it to the dampness of the evening. Dampness can indeed wreak havoc on strings, Whimsy conceded. And what of the audience? Any disturbances? Any unexpected arrivals? No one of note, save for a few villagers whose usual mild-mannered demeanor seemed, I confess, a touch more animated. Whimsy's lips quirked. Animated in what manner? Whispered conversations, furtive glances, the occasional nervous cough. I sensed undercurrents, though nothing concrete. Understood, Whimsy said thoughtfully. Now, Reverend, may I ask about the sherry? Was it your responsibility to ensure refreshments were arranged? I did see to the order, Fanshawe admitted, but the actual laying out was left to Mrs. Bletchley, our venerable housekeeper. She is meticulous in such matters. Of course. Whimsy paused, steepling his fingers. Did you note who served the sherry at the hall? Mr. Gallinger did, if memory serves. He insisted on pouring himself and his guests. 5 glasses, I believe. Yes, that is correct. Whimsy's eyes met Fanshawe's with an almost imperceptible gleam. May I ask if you tasted the sherry? The vicar's face registered surprise. No, I did not partake. The excitement of the evening distracted me. Understandable. Did anyone else, to your knowledge, refuse the sherry? Miss Vale appeared hesitant but accepted. The others, Miss Climpson, Mr. Barnaby, Mrs. Bletchley, all drank. And no one else suffered ill effects? Whimsy pressed. None that I am aware of. Whimsy made a brief note and shifted the subject. Reverend, I understand there was an argument between Mr. Gallinger and Mr. Barnaby earlier in the day. Might you shed light on that? Fanshawe sighed. Regrettably, yes. It concerned the legal title of a small parcel of land adjoining the churchyard. Mr. Gallinger claimed it had been bequeathed to him by an aunt. Mr. Barnaby disputed this, stating the title was unclear. A classic dispute, then. Indeed. Both men are stubborn, and the quarrel was heated. I attempted to mediate, but to little avail. Were there witnesses? Only Mrs. Bletchley, who heard raised voices but was otherwise occupied. Thank you, Reverend. Lastly, a practical question. Was the hall door locked after the recital began? Fanshawe considered. Yes, the main doors were secured by the verger. This was to prevent disturbances during the performance. Were the windows also closed? Not all. The large window to the side was left slightly ajar to provide ventilation. Interesting. Whimsy stood and gestured politely. I appreciate your candor, Reverend. I may have further questions, but this is most helpful. As Whimsy departed, his mind turned over the details. The chipped glass, the ajar window, the disputed inheritance, the mysterious note in the music, all threads weaving a complex tapestry. Returning to the hall, he requested to see the scene of the recital. The piano, an imposing black grand, dominated the stage. Whimsy approached it and ran his hand lightly over the keys, noting the faint residue of moisture along the edges. Examining the chipped glass Miss Vale mentioned, Whimsy held it to the light. The flaw was minor but distinct, just enough to catch a finger and perhaps distract a moment's attention. He then turned his scrutiny to the buffet table. The sherry decanter stood half empty. Nearby, a tray of untouched canapes bore silent witness to a celebration interrupted. Whimsy paused by the ajar window, feeling the chill draught. An open window in an otherwise locked hall, he mused aloud. A potential ingress or egress unnoticed. The verger, a rotund man with a face as stern as the church clock, stood nearby. Whimsy engaged him casually. Did you notice anyone approach or leave through that window? The verger's brow furrowed. No, Lord Peter. I would have noticed, though I admit I was occupied ensuring the candles were lit and the heating working. Understandable. And the soundproofing. The hall is old, is it not? Very. But the walls are thick and the wooden panels do muffle sound somewhat. Could a conversation be overheard from outside? Difficult, but not impossible, if one were very close. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. Thank you. As the verger moved away, Whimsy's gaze lingered on the piano keys, recalling Miss Vale's account of the deliberate false note. Was the note itself a warning or merely a distraction? He felt the faintest thrill of the hunt, the slow peeling back of layers to reveal the human motives beneath. His attention returned to the chipped glass. Could the damage have been exploited? Perhaps to introduce poison? The chilled sherry was unusual. Gallinger's preference for it at room temperature suggested he was compromised. Whimsy made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Bletchley next, to learn more about the arrangements and whether anyone had access to the refreshments beforehand. The village's polite veneer concealed fissures of greed, resentment, and fear. Each new detail, however trivial it seemed, added weight to the balance, bringing the truth ever closer to light. And Lord Peter Whimsy, with his arch wit and unfailing logic, was not one to be deceived by appearances. The morning following his conversation with Reverend Fanshawe found Lord Peter Whimsy standing in the quiet kitchen of the vicarage, face tilted toward the pale light filtering through the lace curtains. The aroma of brewing tea mingled with the faint scent of beeswax polish and the faintest trace of something less definable, perhaps the anxiety lingering from the previous evening's recital. Mrs. Bletchley, the housekeeper, was a formidable presence, her frame solid and unyielding, much like the wooden furniture she so diligently maintained. She moved with purpose, her hands deftly arranging plates and cups on the linen-draped sideboard, the silver cutlery gleaming beneath her vigilant gaze. "Mrs. Bletchley," Whimsy began, adopting his customary tone of mild reprimand. "One does hope the sherry was of adequate quality. Such a lapse, as experienced by poor Mr. Gallinger, would be most regrettable, would it not?" The housekeeper gave a terse nod. "The sherry was the same as always, Lord Peter. I ordered it from the same supplier as for the last 5 years. Mr. Gallinger himself tasted it before the evening began and declared it satisfactory. Yet only 5 glasses were poured. Yes, the usual number for his closest acquaintances, including himself. He was very particular about the quantity. And the serving? You did not pour the drinks yourself?" No. Mr. Gallinger insisted on doing it personally. He said he preferred to be certain of the measure." Whimsy's eyes twinkled faintly. "A man of exacting habits, then. But I gather from your tone that the arrangements for the evening were otherwise uneventful." Mrs. Bletchley hesitated, a faint crease appearing between her brows. "There was one thing, my lord. I noticed that a small salver, the silver one I use for the sherry, was missing when I went to prepare the table. I thought little of it then, perhaps it was misplaced, but it was not found before the recital." "Curious," Whimsy murmured. "Was it ever recovered?" "No, my lord." "Thank you, Mrs. Bletchley. Your attention to detail is invaluable." With that, he took his leave, his mind already racing to assemble the fragments of information. The missing salver, the chipped glass, the open window, all seemed like minor curiosities, yet to Whimsy, such trifles often proved pivotal. Next, he sought out Miss Climpson, who had been seated in the front row during the recital. She was a petite woman with a nervous disposition and eyes that darted like a startled bird's. She greeted Whimsy with a forced smile and wrung her gloved hands. "Miss Climpson," Whimsy began, "your testimony regarding the recital would be most helpful. You were close enough to observe Mr. Gallinger closely, were you not?" "Yes, Lord Peter, I was," she replied, voice trembling slightly. "He seemed agitated before he began, pacing behind the curtains. Did you notice anything unusual about his demeanor?" "Indeed. He appeared distracted, almost fearful at times. And that false note, the wrong note, was so unlike him. It was deliberate, I'm certain." "Deliberate?" Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" Miss Climpson's gaze dropped. He glanced towards the wings of the stage as if sending a message, and when the note rang out, there was a sharp intake of breath from the audience. "An intended signal, perhaps?" She nodded. "I believe so." "And after the recital?" He collapsed almost immediately. There was confusion and then the terrible discovery. Whimsy's mind drew tight the invisible threads. A man fearful, sending messages in music, a missing salver, and the ever-present chipped glass. Miss Climpson, did you see anyone approach the stage during the performance? No one that I noticed, but the hall was darkened, and I was focused on the pianist. Thank you. One last question. Did you hear any unusual sounds during the recital? Footsteps, voices, anything out of place? She frowned. No, but there was a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor just before the false note. A rustling? Whimsy echoed thoughtfully. Yes, it was brief but noticeable. Whimsy left her with a polite nod and made his way to the village post office, where Mr. Barnaby was attending to the morning's mail. The man greeted him with a mixture of wariness and resignation, as if the weight of suspicion had begun to erode his usual confidence. Mr. Barnaby, Whimsy said, the dispute over the land adjoining the churchyard has piqued my interest. Might we discuss it further? Barnaby sighed heavily. I suppose there's little point in concealing the truth now, Lord Peter. Excellent. Pray, enlighten me. Barnaby explained how the parcel in question had been bequeathed to a distant relative of the Gallinger family many years prior, but the documentation was ambiguous, leaving ownership open to contestation. This, he said, had fomented tension between himself and Mr. Gallinger. And on the day of the recital, Whimsy asked. We had a heated exchange outside the vicarage. I accused him of scheming to appropriate the land unfairly. He threatened legal action. It was no more than words, I assure you. Did anyone witness this altercation? No one besides Mrs. Bletchley, who was nearby. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Gallinger's behavior during this confrontation? Barnaby hesitated. He was agitated, yes. His hands trembled slightly, and there was a strange glint in his eye, like he was hiding something. Thank you, Mr. Barnaby. One more thing. Do you know if Mr. Gallinger had enemies beyond this dispute? Barnaby's lips thinned. Some whispered about his temper and sharp tongue. But enemies? I would say no. Whimsy left with more questions than answers. The puzzle pieces fit uneasily, and the image they formed was incomplete. As afternoon descended, Whimsy returned to the vicarage to find Mrs. Bletchley waiting in the hall, her expression grave. My lord, she said quietly, I thought you might wish to know. The missing salver has been found. Indeed, Whimsy replied, arching an eyebrow. It was discovered behind the stage curtain, partially hidden beneath a pile of discarded music sheets. Curious. And its condition? Clean, save for a faint smear of something reddish-brown. Blood? Whimsy queried. It appears so, though not dried. Whimsy's mind raced. The salver, hidden and stained. This was no accident. Someone had taken care to conceal it. He requested to examine the music sheets beneath which the salver had been found. They were scattered, some crumpled, others torn as if hastily discarded. Among them was a sheet bearing an unusual annotation in a cramped hand, scarcely legible. The false note is the key. Whimsy's lips curled into a thin smile. The pianist's mistake was a message deliberately left to be deciphered. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the vicarage windows. The village was settling into its quiet rhythm, unaware of the dark undercurrents surfacing beneath its genteel exterior. Lord Peter Whimsy stood at the window, contemplating the tangled web. The chipped glass, the false note, the missing salver, and the stained trace upon it, all led inexorably toward a truth someone wished to bury. Tomorrow promised more revelations. For now, the game was afoot, and Whimsy's keen intellect was poised to unravel the mystery that had turned a simple recital into a deadly drama. The early morning mist clung stubbornly to the village green as Lord Peter Whimsy made his way toward the churchyard, his thoughts preoccupied with the tangled threads he had uncovered. The faint chill in the air seemed to mirror the unease settling deep within him. a subtle warning that beneath the village's peaceful facade, something dark and calculated was at work. His first visit was to the churchyard itself, the small patch of earth beside the ivy-covered wall where the disputed parcel lay. The grass was still damp with dew, and the low hum of village life had yet to stir fully. Whimsy's eyes scanned the ground carefully, noting the unevenness of the earth and the faint impressions of recent footsteps. He knelt, running a gloved finger along the edge of a weathered headstone, where a small rusted nail protruded awkwardly. As he straightened, a figure approached from the lane, a woman, slender and purposeful, her face framed by a simple bonnet. It was Miss Vale, the pianist's close companion. Her expression was wary but resolute, and she halted a respectful distance away. "Lord Peter," she said quietly, "I thought I might find you here." "Miss Vale, a timely encounter. Your presence here is welcome," Whimsy replied. "I trust you slept well after such a harrowing night." She managed a faint smile, as well as one can under the circumstances. "I have been pondering the recital's strange notes and the message they might contain." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, the annotation on the discarded sheet music hinted that the false note was a key. "Have you considered its meaning further?" She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I believe it may be a warning directed at someone in the hall that evening. A subtle signal meant to convey danger without alarming others." "An intriguing hypothesis. And the rustling you mentioned, might that indicate the presence of another?" "Yes. I fear someone was lurking just out of sight, moving stealthily enough to avoid detection, but close enough to be observed by keen ears." Whimsy regarded her for a moment. "Miss Vale, your insight is invaluable. Might you accompany me as I investigate the parcel of land itself? There are details there which merit close inspection." Together, they moved toward the patch of earth adjacent to the churchyard wall. Whimsy's eyes took in the overgrown grass and scattered leaves. He knelt once more, running his fingers over a subtle depression in the soil. "Recent disturbance," he observed. "Something or someone has disturbed the earth here, quite deliberately." Miss Vale peered closely. "Could it be where the missing salver was hidden?" "It is possible," Whimsy agreed. "And it may also be connected to the land dispute you mentioned, Miss Vale. Perhaps the key to this mystery lies buried beneath more than soil." They stood, exchanging a glance heavy with unspoken urgency. Whimsy's thoughts turned next to the stained salver. The reddish smear, faint but unmistakable, suggested violence, yet the source remained elusive. As they walked back toward the village, Whimsy shared his plan to question the village doctor, a man who had attended to Mr. Gallinger's final moments. The doctor's knowledge of symptoms and cause of death might shed light on whether poison was involved, and if so, what kind. The doctor's surgery was a modest brick building nestled near the village green. Inside, the scent of disinfectant mingled with the faint traces of herbal tinctures. Dr. Harrow, a middle-aged man with keen eyes and a calm demeanor, greeted Whimsy with professional courtesy. "Lord Peter," he said, "I trust your inquiries proceed with due care." "Doctor, your expertise is vital. Tell me, what precisely caused Mr. Gallinger's sudden collapse?" Dr. Harrow's brow furrowed. The symptoms were consistent with acute poisoning, though the exact agent is difficult to specify without laboratory analysis. He exhibited rapid onset of nausea, dizziness, and severe abdominal pain. Was there evidence of physical trauma? No external wounds beyond the faint bruising consistent with a fall after collapse. The rapid deterioration points strongly toward a toxic substance. Whimsy leaned forward. Might the poison have been administered through ingestion? Almost certainly. The sherry he consumed stands out as the probable vehicle. Had you tested the remaining sherry for toxins? Samples were taken immediately. Preliminary screening suggests the presence of atropine-like compounds, though confirmation requires further testing. "Atropine," Whimsy mused. "A potent poison, slow-acting yet deadly in small doses. Precisely. It also causes confusion and hallucination, symptoms Mr. Gallagher displayed prior to his collapse. Whimsy's mind raced, connecting the dots. The chipped glass, the false note as a warning, the suspicious sherry, and now the possibility of atropine poisoning. Doctor, was there anyone known to have access to the sherry before the recital? The housekeeper and Mr. Gallagher himself primarily. Others may have been in proximity but lacked direct access. Thank you, Doctor. Your insights are most helpful. Leaving the surgery, Whimsy considered the tight circle of suspects. The missing salver's stain, the disputed land, the argument with Mr. Barnaby, each piece hinted at a motive and an opportunity. Later that afternoon, Whimsy and Miss Vale returned to the vicarage, where they found Mrs. Bletchley waiting anxiously. Her usual composure was strained, and she clutched a folded piece of paper with trembling hands. "My lord," she said, "I came across this note hidden in the vicarage study. It was tucked inside a book of psalms behind a loose panel." Whimsy unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged but legible. "Beware the silent witness. The truth lies where shadows meet." A cryptic message laden with menace and secrecy. "Miss Vale, Mrs. Bletchley," Whimsy said, "this confirms that our suspect is aware of the investigation and seeks to intimidate or mislead." He folded the note with deliberate care. "We must tread cautiously. The shadows hold more than darkness here." Night began to fall, and the village settled under a cloak of quiet. Yet within the walls of the vicarage, the air was thick with anticipation. Whimsy's keen eyes caught the flicker of candlelight dancing against the shelves, shadows weaving their own stories. He paced slowly, piecing together the puzzle. The false note, a deliberate warning. The poisoned sherry, a calculated act. The land dispute, a motive. And now, the threatening message, a signal that the perpetrator remained close, watching. As the hour grew late, a sudden sharp knock at the door startled the household. Whimsy opened it to reveal the verger, his usually stern face pale and drawn. "Lord Peter," he whispered, urgently, "there's been a discovery in the church crypt." Whimsy's heart quickened. The game was far from over. The deeper they delved, the darker the mystery became. Stepping into the night, he knew the path ahead was fraught with peril, but also with the promise of revelation. The secrets buried beneath the village were beginning to surface, and Lord Peter Whimsy was determined to uncover every one of them. The church crypt was damp and cold, a repository of silent stones and whispered memories, where shadows lingered longer than light dared. Lord Peter Whimsy stepped carefully down the narrow steps, the beam of his lantern piercing the gloom. The verger followed close behind, his breath shallow, the weight of his discovery heavy upon him. "The sexton found it just after dawn," the verger whispered, voice cracking slightly. A coffin lid shifted, a faint scrape on the flagstones. When he moved it aside, he saw a bundle, wrapped in cloth, pressed against the wall. Whimsy's eyes adjusted to the dim, revealing the uneven floor of aged stone, worn by centuries of feet. Near the far corner, beneath a low arch, the sexton knelt beside the object in question, a ragged bundle sealed with twine. Carefully, Whimsy approached, crouching beside the sexton. With a glance to the verger, he unfastened the twine, revealing a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and stained. The pages were yellowed, brittle, but the ink remained remarkably legible. He opened the journal and scanned the entries quickly. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the words dense with urgency and fear. "Listen to this," Whimsy said softly, reading aloud a passage dated nearly a decade earlier. "The land dispute festers like a wound. I have overheard threats in the vicarage and bitter whispers in the vestry. Should anything happen to me, let these words stand testament to the truth." The verger swallowed hard. "It belonged to Mr. Gallagher's predecessor, Reverend Wilcox. He died suddenly, claimed to be from natural causes, but some believed otherwise. "Indeed," Whimsy murmured, "and this journal suggests there was motive for murder even then." The sexton nodded. "I never thought it relevant, but now things make more sense." Whimsy's mind turned to the stained salver, the poisoned sherry, the false note signaling danger. The past and present tangled into one grim tapestry. He turned another page. "The silver salver is the symbol of trust in this parish. To hide it is to conceal betrayal." A faint sketch beneath the writing depicted the very salver found behind the stage curtain. A sudden noise made them all freeze, the distant echo of footsteps from above. The verger's face paled. "Someone else is here." Whimsy rose swiftly. "Stay alert. We must secure this place." Ascending the stairs, they found the churchyard bathed in early morning light. A lone figure stood near the church door, a man in a long coat, head bowed against the chill. He looked up, startled, revealing a sharp face with eyes full of calculation. "Mr. Barnaby," Whimsy greeted him coolly. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Barnaby's jaw tightened. "I came as soon as I heard. That journal, Reverend Wilcox's secrets, could ruin many." "Then you admit knowledge of its contents?" Barnaby's gaze flickered. "Only what I've heard in whispers. It's not my concern." Whimsy's voice sharpened. "Mr. Barnaby, your quarrel with Mr. Gallagher was public knowledge. You had both motive and opportunity. Care to explain what you were doing near the crypt this morning?" Barnaby's eyes narrowed. "I was here to pay respects, and to warn you, some things are better left buried." Before Whimsy could reply, a commotion erupted from the vicarage. Mrs. Bletchley appeared, breathless and distraught. "My lord, Miss Vale has vanished. She left her room early this morning, and no one has seen her since." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Barnaby and the verger. The stakes had escalated beyond anything he had anticipated. "Gather a search party," Whimsy ordered, voice steady despite the surge of urgency. "We cannot afford to lose her or any clue." As the villagers mobilized, Whimsy's mind raced. Miss Vale's disappearance was no coincidence. Whoever wished to keep the church's secrets hidden had taken direct action. He thought back to the threatening note. "Beware the silent witness. The truth lies where shadows meet." Could Miss Vale be that silent witness, the key to unraveling the mystery? The search stretched into the afternoon, covering the winding lanes and hedgerows surrounding the village. At last, a shout came from the edge of the woodlands near the old mill. Whimsy hurried forward, heart pounding, to find Miss Vale sitting on a fallen log, pale but unharmed. She looked up at him with weary relief. "I managed to slip away," she explained. "I overheard voices plotting in the vicarage last night. Someone intended to silence me." "Who?" Whimsy pressed. She hesitated. "I'm not sure, but the tone was cold and resolute." "They fear what I know." Whimsy offered a reassuring smile. "Then we must act swiftly. The village harbors a secret that someone will kill to protect." Together, they returned to the vicarage, where the search party had gathered, whispers circulating like the autumn wind. Whimsy addressed them all with quiet authority. "This is a turning point. We have proof that the past and present crimes are intertwined. We will watch closely and reveal the truth before darkness claims another victim." As dusk fell once more, Lord Peter Whimsy felt the familiar thrill of the chase. The game was far from over, and the shadows still held many secrets yet to be uncovered. As the cold light of evening deepened, casting long shadows over the village, Lord Peter Whimsy convened the gathered household and parish, officials in the vicarage drawing-room. The walls, once adorned with faded tapestries and portraits of long-forgotten rectors, seemed to close in with a weight of expectation. The air was thick with a silence born of suppressed fears and unspoken truths. Whimsy stood near the fireplace, hands loosely clasped behind his back, eyes calmly surveying the room's occupants. The vicar, his countenance pale and drawn. Barnaby, the local solicitor, shifting uneasily. The verger, tense as a spring. Mrs. Bletchley, whose lips twitched nervously, and notably Miss Vale, who despite her ordeal held a fragile composure. "My friends," Wimsey began, voice measured yet carrying the unmistakable authority that commanded attention, "we find ourselves at a crossroads. The journal of Reverend Wilcox has shed new light upon this parish's darker history, illuminating motives that have lain dormant beneath our very feet. Yet it is clear the past has not relinquished its grip lightly." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. It appears that Miss Vale's knowledge, whether intentional or incidental, posed a threat to certain parties within this community. Her disappearance was not a whimsy of fear, but a calculated attempt to stifle revelation. Barnaby's jaw twitched. "This is a serious accusation, Lord Peter. If you suspect—" "I do," Wimsey interrupted with mild impatience. "But I reserve judgment until all facts are in evidence. That is the nature of true inquiry, as opposed to conjecture." Turning to Miss Vale, he added gently, "You overheard voices, you said?" "Yes," she replied, eyes flickering with lingering dread. "Voices speaking of silencing and final measures, words heavy with menace." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. "And the vicarage? Did you perceive any peculiarities in the taming or manner of these discussions?" Miss Vale considered a moment. "They met late, just after the evening prayers. The vicar himself was present, and so was Mr. Barnaby, though he left shortly after." A faint tightening around Barnaby's mouth betrayed his discomfort. The vicar, meanwhile, cleared his throat with visible effort. "Lord Peter, may I remind you that such insinuations cast a pall over the sanctity of our church and its clergy?" he said stiffly. "Mr. Barnaby's presence was purely incidental." "Incidental, Reverend, or essential?" Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "These details matter profoundly. Timing, place, and participants. The trifecta of any thorough investigation." At that moment, a soft tap at the door announced the arrival of Constable Griggs, the local constabulary's representative. He stepped in, clutching a small envelope, his expression grave. "Begging your pardon, my lord," the constable said, "but a parcel arrived for you by courier this afternoon. No return address, and the seal was broken." Wimsey accepted the envelope, breaking the wax with deliberate care. Inside lay a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, inked in a precise, looping script. "The truth you seek is bound by time and place, yet it is not the present, but the past that reveals the guilty hand. Look beyond the obvious. The clock that strikes 13 will guide you." A murmur rippled through the room. Barnaby's face paled further, while the vicar's eyes darted to the ancient clock standing solemnly in the corner, a relic whose single hand pointed stubbornly to midnight. Wimsey folded the note, tucking it carefully into his waistcoat pocket. The phrase, "clock that strikes 13," a curious metaphor, to be sure. He moved toward the tall grandfather clock, running a gloved finger along its carved wooden casing. An impossible hour, a clock that defies time itself. The verger stepped forward, clearing his throat. "That clock has not worked for years, my lord. The mechanism is broken beyond repair. It chimes only once when wound, and even then, erratically." "A broken clock," Wimsey murmured, "yet its symbolism is potent. Time or its distortion must be integral to the riddle before us." He turned back to the room, eyes gleaming with renewed determination. "We must revisit the timeline of events surrounding Mr. Gallinger's death and Miss Vale's disappearance. The mechanics of time, clocks, watches, and the measured intervals of human activity may yet reveal a discrepancy, a gap where deception thrives." The vicar frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Very well, Lord Peter, but where shall we begin?" "Where all investigations begin, with precise inquiry," Wimsey replied, steepling his fingers. "I shall require the cooperation of every witness, every servant, and every resident with even the faintest connection to these events. Details must be scrutinized with the utmost care." As the evening deepened into night, Wimsey conducted a series of interviews, probing for inconsistencies in alibis, cross-examining statements about clocks, schedules, and routines. He noted that Mrs. Bletchley insisted the village clock tower's striking of the hour was always reliable, yet several villagers reported hearing no chimes on the night of the murder. The verger recalled that the church bell, connected to the same mechanism, was silent that evening due to a snapped rope, a detail missed until now. The local grocer mentioned his watch was slow by several minutes that night, a minor irritation that suddenly seemed crucial. Wimsey collected these fragments as if assembling a delicate mosaic. The broken clock in the vicarage, the silent church bell, the grocer's errant watch, all hints of temporal distortion. He paused at a window, gazing out toward the silhouette of the old mill, its wheel motionless under the moon's pale gaze. A staged timeline, he mused aloud. If one manipulates time itself, or the perception thereof, one may manufacture an alibi that defies scrutiny. Miss Vale approached quietly. "Lord Peter, I recall seeing a clock in Mr. Barnaby's study, the kind with a pendulum. It struck once when I entered, but it was much later than I should have been inside." Barnaby's eyes flashed. "Miss Vale, that is nonsense. You could not have been in my study after the hour of 10. "Could I not?" Wimsey interjected. "Let us test this claim." He directed that the study be inspected immediately. The pendulum clock was intact, but had been wound recently, its hands set at a suspiciously arbitrary time. The bell inside was silent, though the mechanism suggested it should chime at the hour. "Someone has tampered with this clock," Wimsey observed, "a subtle sabotage designed to confuse the chronology." Turning toward Barnaby, he continued, "And your insistence on precise timing, could it be that your alibi is founded not on fact, but on manufactured time?" Barnaby's composure faltered for a fleeting moment, a crack in the polished facade. Before Wimsey could press further, a sharp rap came at the door, and the constable entered once more, bearing news from the village. The salver had been found, hidden, as it turned out, inside the old vestry cupboard. But it bore a faint stain, dark and sticky, unmistakably recent. Wimsey's eyes narrowed. The salver, the poison, the clocks, all threads woven into a design meant to deceive. He stepped to the hearth, removing his gloves and lighting a cigarette with his habitual languor. "This is no mere crime of passion or greed. This is an orchestration, a symphony of deceit in which time itself is the instrument." The room fell silent, the gravity of the revelation settling over all present. "I propose we reconvene tomorrow at dawn," Wimsey concluded, "to reconstruct the final hours with the benefit of these insights. Until then, I advise all present to rest, but be wary. The one who manipulates time may yet attempt to rewrite the end of this story." As the guests dispersed, whispers of fear and speculation trailing behind them, Wimsey remained at the window, the cryptic note burning in his pocket. A clock that strikes 13 indeed. The key to unlocking the puzzle lay hidden in the folds of time, and time, as he knew all too well, was a most merciless judge. The first rays of dawn filtered weakly through the leaded windows of the vicarage as Lord Peter Wimsey prepared to resume his inquiries. The house had settled into a muted stillness, disturbed only by the distant crow of a cock and the faint rustling of leaves outside. There was a peculiar tension in the air, as though the very walls awaited the unraveling of the night's mysteries. Wimsey, donning his customary tweed and silk cravat, surveyed the room with the keen eye of a man whose mind was already several steps ahead. His thoughts lingered on the cryptic note, the clock that strikes 13. It was a riddle, a metaphor, and a literal clue, all at once. He was certain that the temporal inconsistencies uncovered the previous evening were no accident, but the deliberate handiwork of a mind skilled in subterfuge. He summoned Miss Vale to his side, her presence calm despite the turmoil she had endured. "Miss Vale," he began, "I must ask you again about the timing of your movements on the evening in question. Every detail, however small, is now of paramount importance." She nodded, folding her hands neatly. "Very well, Lord Peter. After the concert at St. Mary's, I returned here around 9 o'clock, as the vicar had requested I stay the night. It was then that I heard voices in the vestry, low, urgent, and unmistakably hostile." "Did you see who they were?" "No, only shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. But one voice I recognized. It was the vicar's. And the others. I could not be sure, but one was deep and rasping. Perhaps Mr. Barnaby's." Wimsey considered this, then asked, "And the salver, was it present during your observations?" She looked puzzled. "I had no reason to look for it, my lord." "A reasonable oversight," he acknowledged. "Yet the salver, now discovered in the vestry cupboard, stained and concealed, suggests a hasty attempt to hide evidence. One wonders who had the opportunity and motive to do so." The door opened quietly to admit the vicar, who regarded Wimsey with a mixture of deference and unease. "Lord Peter, might I remind you that suspicion directed at any member of this parish carries weighty consequences. The salver's discovery is unfortunate but hardly conclusive." "Indeed, Reverend," Wimsey replied with a courteous bow of his head. "Yet the stain upon it is unmistakably recent and of a substance that cannot be ignored. May I request the opportunity to examine your study once more? There are still temporal anomalies to resolve." The vicar hesitated but acquiesced. As Wimsey re-entered the study, he examined the pendulum clock with renewed scrutiny. The clock's hands rested just past 10, but the chime was silent. Wimsey's fingers found a minute notch on the clock face's rim, a subtle catch that, when pressed, silenced the chime mechanism. "Deliberate, no doubt," he murmured, "to suppress the hour's toll and deny others the natural marker of time." From a drawer, he retrieved a small pocket watch belonging to the grocer, its slow ticking audible in the quiet. He compared its time to the pendulum clock, noting a discrepancy of nearly 15 minutes. The village, it seems, was not as punctual as it might wish to appear. Footsteps approached and Barnaby entered, face pale but mask firmly in place. "Lord Peter, you accuse me of sabotage based on trifles. Surely you do not imagine me so petty." Wimsey fixed him with a gaze that was at once penetrating and sardonic. "Mr. Barnaby, it is not pettiness but calculation, I suspect. A deliberate effort to manipulate the perception of time and thus construct an alibi immune to scrutiny." Barnaby's hand twitched, betraying a brief flicker of panic. "You have no proof?" "Yet," Wimsey replied smoothly. "The study clock's tampering, the silent church bell, and the grocer's slow watch form a pattern too coherent to be coincidence." Barnaby faltered but rallied. "And what of the vicar's presence during those late meetings?" "An actor on a stage, Mr. Barnaby, unwitting or otherwise." Before Barnaby could respond, the door burst open and the verger entered, breathless. "Lord Peter, I have news from the mill. The miller found something strange near the water wheel." Intrigued, Wimsey gathered the party and accompanied the verger to the mill, where the morning mist still clung to the silent machinery. Near the base of the wheel lay a folded piece of cloth, dark, damp, and embroidered with the initials E.G. Wimsey carefully unfolded the cloth, revealing a monogrammed handkerchief stained with a faint trace of the same dark substance found on the salver. "This," Wimsey said softly, "is no accident. The handkerchief belongs to none other than Edward Gallagher himself. It appears he struggled near the mill before his death." The vicar swallowed. "I was unaware he ventured so far that night." Wimsey shook his head. "The geography of his last movements has been obscured, perhaps deliberately. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy gathered all present. It is evident that Mr. Gallinger's death was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan designed to mislead and confuse by manipulating time and place. The salver's concealment, the tampered clocks, and the displaced handkerchief form parts of a mosaic that, when viewed as a whole, reveals the true narrative. He paused, letting the tension mount. The question remains: who among you benefits from this deception? Who possessed the means to tamper with clocks, access the vestry, and stage the scene at the mill? Eyes darted nervously. Whimsy fixed Barnaby once more. Mr. Barnaby, you are the only one with unfettered access to the study and its timepieces. Barnaby's face contorted. I deny these accusations. Yet, Mr. Barnaby, Whimsy countered, it is you who attempted to control time itself, to fabricate innocence. And it is you who must answer for the death of Edward Gallinger. Barnaby's composure shattered. You have no proof. You rely on shadows and whispers. But shadows sometimes reveal more than light, Whimsy said, voice low and incisive. And whispers can carry the truth to those willing to listen. As constables moved to restrain Barnaby, Whimsy allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The clock had indeed struck 13, an impossible hour, but one that had unraveled the web of deceit spun with such precision. The room's atmosphere shifted from dread to reluctant relief. Yet Whimsy remained thoughtful, aware that justice was seldom as neat as the logical puzzles he so loved to solve. The human heart, after all, was a more inscrutable mechanism than any clock. Let us hope, he mused aloud, that time will now restore balance to this troubled parish. With that, he turned away, already anticipating the final act yet to come. The dawn had long surrendered to the bustling midday sun when Lord Peter Whimsy found himself once more within the sombre confines of the vicarage study. The air was thick with anticipation, the household now reduced to a tense silence that seemed to hold its breath in the presence of impending revelation. The servants whispered behind closed doors, the villagers peered curiously from their windows, and yet within this chamber, all eyes, save for Whimsy's, were fixed on the figure seated by the hearth. Barnaby, gaunt and defiant, yet undeniably shaken. Whimsy stood with the poise of a man about to deliver a verdict not just of guilt, but of human frailty and desperate concealment. Mr. Barnaby, he began, voice calm but edged with inexorable finality, you have maintained a facade of innocence with commendable fervor, yet it is the intricate web of your own design that entangles you most cruelly. Barnaby's lip curled in contempt, but there was no escaping the weight of the detective's gaze. You will find no confession here, Lord Peter. I'm as unjustly accused as any man might be. On the contrary, Whimsy replied, your guilt is not a matter of opinion, but of irrefutable sequence and circumstance. He paused, allowing the room to absorb the gravity of the moment before continuing. The manipulation of timepieces was but the most superficial of your artifices. It was, I dare say, a clumsy attempt to divert suspicion, a diversion too predictable for one of your experience. Turning to the assembled company, Whimsy gestured elegantly. Permit me, then, to reconstruct the events of that night as they truly transpired. He began with the seemingly innocuous concert at St. Mary's, where Edward Gallinger had been observed in amiable spirits, his fingers dancing across the piano keys with the usual delicate precision. The note he struck at the close of his performance was indeed wrong, Whimsy mused, but it was the silence that followed, the absence of the final chord, that should have raised alarm. A subtle but telling sign of interrupted intent. Miss Vale nodded faintly, eyes fixed on the detective's every word. The vestry meeting, purportedly peaceful, concealed an altercation. Voices were overheard, raised and then abruptly hushed. The absence of the vicar's customary evening prayer was no accident. It was a prelude to disruption. Whimsy's gaze flicked to Barnaby. You and the Reverend conspired, willingly or not, to conceal a truth far darker than any minor scandal. Barnaby's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. After the quarrel, Mr. Gallagher fled, Wimsey continued, voice lowering to a near whisper. In panic or rage, he sought refuge near the mill, where the struggle continued. The handkerchief stained with your mark was dropped there, no doubt in haste. A slight shudder passed through Barnaby, a crack in his otherwise steadfast demeanor. The salver's concealment in the vestry cupboard was your final act of desperation, an attempt to erase evidence of the struggle. At this, Barnaby's composure faltered entirely. You weave fantasies, Lord Peter. I did what was necessary to protect this parish and its good name. Protect or possess? Wimsey challenged, stepping closer. The parish and its people are owed the truth, not protection from it. And it was you who feared exposure, the exposure of a betrayal far greater than a quarrel over money or status. He produced a folded letter from his breast pocket, worn at the edges and sealed with a familiar crest. This letter, found hidden in the vicar's desk, reveals your duplicity, secret dealings with outside interests, attempts to undermine the Reverend, and threats made against Edward Gallagher himself. The room gasped, the tension now a palpable force. Barnaby's face twisted with rage and defeat. You have no right, no proof that stands before the law. Proof, Wimsey replied dryly, is not always the loud proclamation of guilt, but the quiet accumulation of impossibilities that collapse under scrutiny. He moved to the window, gazing outward at the now sunlit village. The clock that strikes 13 is a symbol of your overreach, a temporal impossibility, much like your alibi. Returning, Wimsey fixed Barnaby with a final, piercing look. The law will decide your fate, but it is truth, not justice alone, that must prevail. As constables approached to take Barnaby into custody, he cast a final glare at Wimsey. You may have won today, but the sins of a man's past often reach beyond the grasp of a mere detective. Wimsey offered a faint smile, the dry irony unmistakable. And yet, Mr. Barnaby, it is the keen mind and patient observation of a detective that often wrests those sins into the light, for even time, as you well know, yields to scrutiny. With Barnaby led away, the vicarage began to breathe once more. Miss Vale exhaled, a fragile smile touching her lips. Wimsey gathered his coat and hat, preparing to depart. Miss Vale, he said, voice touched with a rare warmth, your courage in these trying times has been admirable. May your faith remain unshaken. She inclined her head, eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Lord Peter. Your insight has brought clarity where there was only confusion. As Wimsey stepped into the sunlight, the village seemed to exhale, its secrets momentarily laid bare. Walking away from the vicarage, Lord Peter lit a cigar and mused aloud to himself, Time is a most deceptive companion. Sometimes our greatest ally, sometimes our cruelest betrayer. Yet as with all puzzles, it yields to those willing to read between its ticks. He paused, casting a glance back at the fading silhouette of the vicarage. After all, he concluded with a dry chuckle, the clock that strikes 13 is merely waiting for the right hand to turn back its face. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of the vicarage study, where a small gathering had assembled at Lord Peter Wimsey's discreet invitation. The room, still heavy with the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and polished wood, seemed to hold its breath as Wimsey prepared to unravel the last knot in this tangled skein. Wimsey's manner was as composed and arch as ever, though beneath the polite veneer there lay a razor-sharp mind poised to dissect the final strand of deception. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, with a faint smile that promised both revelation and reproof, we have, over the past days, been treated to a curious drama in which every character has played a role. Some knowingly, some unwittingly, in the curious symphony of mystery surrounding the unfortunate demise of Edward Gallagher. His eyes flicked to the assembled faces, Miss Vale's pale countenance, the still resolute Barnaby, the quietly expectant vicar, and the attentive constables. Allow me, if you will, to recount the key movements of this orchestration. He paced slowly, each step deliberate. Mr. Barnaby's initial attempt to divert suspicion with altered clocks was a superficial, yet telling, miscalculation. Time, as it happens, is not so easily manipulated. The apparent impossibility of the final note, struck incorrectly at the concert's close, was no accident but a signal, subtle and desperate. He paused, allowing the tension to tighten. The crucial oversight lay not in the grand gestures, but in the minutiae. The misplaced handkerchief, the silenced church bell, the locked vestry door with its peculiar latch. These were not random details, but deliberate clues, planted by a mind desperate to conceal a deeper truth. Turning his gaze to Barnaby, Wimsey continued. The motive, often obscured by the smoke of suspicion and theatrical misdirection, was born not of greed or petty rivalry, but of a profound fear. Fear of exposure. Exposure not only of your clandestine dealings, but of a fracture within the very fabric of this community you sought to protect at any cost. Wimsey's voice softened, yet each word cut sharply. Edward Gallinger, gifted artist though he was, had stumbled upon your secret, a betrayal that threatened your standing and livelihood. His death was, regrettably, the tragic consequence of this collision. The room was silent, save for the faint crackling of the hearth fire. Wimsey's eyes twinkled briefly with that familiar dry irony. It is a curious paradox that those who seek to preserve order often sow chaos, and that the hands which strike the final note in a melody can just as easily strike the final blow. He turned once more to the assembly. Justice, in its slow and measured way, will now take its course, but let this be a reminder that beneath the genteel surface of any village or parish lies a well of secrets, some benign, others deadly. With a graceful nod, Wimsey signaled the constables who moved to take Barnaby into custody. The gaunt man's defiance had finally crumbled, replaced by a hollow resignation. As the party dispersed, Wimsey lingered a moment with Miss Vale. I trust, Miss Vale, that your faith in humanity and in reason remains intact. She smiled faintly, the ordeal having tempered but not extinguished her hope. Wimsey adjusted his hat and stepped into the fading light. With a final glance at the tranquil village, he mused aloud, "In the end, it is not the wrong note that defines the music, but the silence that follows. The truth waiting patiently in the pauses." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey vanished down the winding country lane, leaving behind a village forever changed and a mystery laid to rest by wit, patience, and impeccable logic.